At the heart of a vast valley, once filled with shimmering lakes, a vision appeared. According to legend, it was a prophecy that guided a wandering people to their destiny. An eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. For the Mexica, later known to the world as the Aztecs, this was the divine sign that would change history forever. It was here, in the middle of Lake Texcoco, that they would build their city. A city that would defy geography, outlast empires, and one day rise again as one of the largest metropolises on Earth. But before the skyscrapers, before the highways, before the noise of 22 million people, there was only water, reeds, and the will to survive. The story begins around the early 1300s, when the Valley of Mexico was a mosaic of lakes and fertile islands. Dozens of city-states, each with their own rulers, languages, and gods, competed for control. Among them, the Mexica were outsiders. They had migrated into the valley from the north, possibly from a place they called Aztlán. Other tribes saw them as uncivilized, barbaric, and unworthy of land. They were forced to live on the swampy margins of Lake Texcoco, lands no one else wanted. But that exile became their strength. In 1325, the Mexica saw their sacred sign on a small island in the lake and began to build Tenochtitlan, the place of the prickly pear cactus. At first, it seemed impossible. The ground was soft, the waters deep, and food scarce. But the Mexica were determined. They learned to build artificial islands called chinampas, floating gardens anchored with reeds and mud that allowed them to grow crops on the lake itself. Over time, these gardens fed a growing population and transformed the shallow waters into a living cityscape. Tenochtitlan expanded rapidly. Canals replaced streets, canoes replaced carts, and temples rose like islands of stone above the shimmering blue. By the mid-1400s, it had become one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world, home to over 200,000 people, more than any European capital of its time. The Mexica forged alliances with neighboring powers, the cities of Texcoco and Tlacopan, to form what would become the Aztec Triple Alliance. Together, they waged wars across Mesoamerica, expanding their territory and demanding tribute from conquered regions. Gold, jade, cacao, and feathers flowed into Tenochtitlan, turning it into the beating heart of an empire. The city's main plaza, the Templo Mayor, stood as a symbol of both faith and fear, a twin pyramid dedicated to the gods Huitzilopochtli, the sun and war god, and Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility. Here, sacrifices were performed to ensure the world's survival. The Aztecs believed the sun itself required nourishment from human blood to keep moving across the sky. To outsiders, it was a world both awe-inspiring and terrifying. And it was this paradox, a civilization of breathtaking artistry and ruthless religion, that would one day attract the attention of newcomers from across the ocean. By the late 14th century, Tenochtitlan had reached its height. The causeways connected it to the mainland. Aqueducts brought fresh water from mountain springs. Markets buzzed with trade from across the empire. Chroniclers later described thousands of merchants gathering daily in the marketplace of Tlatelolco, selling everything from obsidian blades to tropical fruits, luxury textiles, and pottery. It was a city of order and spectacle, where priests climbed temple steps to perform rituals under the rising sun, and warriors paraded through the streets adorned with jaguar pelts and eagle feathers. Every structure, every ceremony reinforced one idea: the Mexica were chosen by the gods. But destiny, it seems, has a cruel sense of irony. In 1519, strange ships appeared on the eastern coast of Mexico. Their sails shone white against the horizon, their men carried weapons never seen before, and their leader, Hernán Cortés, was about to change Tenochtitlan forever. Cortés and his men marched inland, forming alliances with tribes who had suffered under Aztec rule. To them, the Spaniards were not invaders, but a possible salvation. As Cortés approached the Valley of Mexico, he was met with gifts of gold, food, and feathered costumes from emissaries of the Aztec emperor, Moctezuma II. The emperor had heard of these strangers and their mysterious animals, horses, and feared they might be divine. The legend of Quetzalcoatl, a pale-skinned god who would return from the east, haunted Moctezuma's mind. Whether out of awe or political caution, he welcomed the Spaniards into his city. When Cortés and his men first saw Tenochtitlan, they were stunned. Built on water, with dazzling temples and wide causeways, the city looked to them like a dream, a Venice in the New World. Spanish chronicler Bernal Díaz del Castillo would later write that no one in Europe had ever seen such a place. But peace between the two worlds could never last. Tensions grew as the Spaniards' hunger for gold became clear. The Aztecs, realizing their guests had come not as gods but conquerors, rebelled. In 1520, during a festival in the main temple, Spanish soldiers massacred Aztec nobles, sparking outrage throughout the city. The streets erupted in violence. Moctezuma was killed. Whether by his own people or by the Spaniards remains unclear. Cortés and his forces were driven from the city in a chaotic night of bloodshed known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. But the Spaniards regrouped. They gathered thousands of native allies and returned with a vengeance. In 1521, after months of siege, starvation, and disease, Tenochtitlan fell. The once great city, its temples burning, its canals choked with corpses, was reduced to rubble. Lake Texcoco ran red. The Aztec Empire, which had ruled central Mexico for nearly a century, was gone. In 1521, the smoke had barely lifted from the ruins of Tenochtitlan. The canals were clogged with debris and the bodies of the fallen. The temples were blackened by fire. The air hung heavy with the scent of ash and defeat. But in this devastation, Hernán Cortés saw something else, a beginning. He stood over the wreckage of the Aztec capital and declared it the site of a new empire. On the bones of Tenochtitlan, he would build a city for Spain. And in that moment, the story of Mexico City began again, this time under a new god, a new crown, and a new order that would reshape the continent. Cortés wasted no time. The Spanish crown claimed all of Mexico, New Spain, and Mexico City was chosen as its capital. The transformation was swift and absolute. What had once been the sacred heart of the Aztecs became the administrative and spiritual center of Spanish America. The conquistadores tore down temples and erected cathedrals in their place. El Templo Mayor, once the axis of Aztec religion, was dismantled stone by stone. On its foundations rose the Metropolitan Cathedral, one of the grandest in the New World. The message was clear. The gods of the Mexica were gone. The cross had replaced the sun. But beneath the grandeur, the transition was not peaceful. The surviving indigenous people were forced into labor, rebuilding their own city under foreign rule. The Spaniards imposed a rigid social hierarchy, Europeans at the top, followed by criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas, mestizos, mixed ancestry, and the indigenous and African peoples at the bottom. Mexico City became the jewel of Spain's empire in the Americas, but its wealth came at a cost. Gold and silver flowed in from the mines of Zacatecas and Guanajuato. Trade routes linked Mexico City to Manila and Madrid. The city grew rich, its streets filled with palaces, monasteries, and bustling markets. But while the elite dined on imported wine and silk, indigenous workers toiled in poverty, rebuilding a city that no longer belonged to them. Still, life in colonial Mexico City was vibrant and complex. The fusion of Spanish and indigenous traditions created a culture unlike any other, one that blended languages, foods, art, and music into something new. But here's something few realize. The city's transformation from water to stone was also a slow disaster. The Spanish drained Lake Texcoco to control flooding and expand the city. They filled the canals and built streets where water once flowed. At first, this made sense, a firm foundation for their European-style city. But in time, the dry lakebed began to sink. Buildings cracked, churches tilted, and entire neighborhoods flooded each rainy season. The problem is, and still is, that Mexico City was built on a lake that never truly disappeared. Every step of its colonial progress came at a cost to the land itself. By the 1600s, Mexico City was both dazzling and fragile. Travelers described its wide plazas, grand cathedrals, and fountains. Carriages rolled through cobblestone streets lined with mansions, while beggars and vendors crowded the edges of the same roads. It was a city of contradictions, wealth and misery, faith and fear, beauty and decay. Then came the disasters that tested its strength. In 1629, a catastrophic flood submerged nearly the entire city for 5 years. Imagine that, 5 years underwater. People traveled by canoe through what was once the city's center. Thousands died from famine and disease. Yet the city endured, rebuilt once again on the same fragile ground. And this was not the only tragedy. Earthquakes shook the valley, plagues swept through its crowded streets, and fires consumed entire blocks. But each time the people rebuilt, Mexico City refused to die. The church, meanwhile, grew into the most powerful institution in New Spain. Convents and monasteries multiplied, not only as places of worship, but as centers of education, charity, and control. Missionaries worked tirelessly to convert indigenous people, sometimes through kindness, sometimes through fear. But the city was never truly silent. Beneath the rituals of faith, whispers of unrest grew. A new generation was emerging, people born in Mexico, not Spain, who began to question why they were treated as lesser in their own land. The seeds of rebellion were being planted in the very soil of the empire's greatest city. By the 1700s, Mexico City had become one of the largest cities in the world, rivaling European capitals in size and splendor. It was the center of trade, science, art, and politics in the Americas. The printing press had arrived, universities flourished, and ideas flowed in from Europe. Ideas about freedom, reason, and the rights of man. These ideas found fertile ground in a society where inequality ruled every corner. While the Spanish crown taxed and controlled from afar, local elites began to dream of independence. And then, in 1810, the spark finally caught fire. Far from Mexico City, in the small town of Dolores, a priest named Miguel Hidalgo rang a church bell and called his people to rise up against Spanish rule. His cry, El Grito de Dolores, ignited a war that would last more than a decade. Mexico City became the prize both sides fought for. Spanish loyalists fortified it, fearing the rebels' advance. The city's residents watched in uncertainty as armies clashed across the countryside. For years, the capital stood as a symbol of colonial power, but as the rebellion spread, that symbol began to crack. The empire's hold weakened. When independence finally came in 1821, it wasn't just the end of Spanish rule, it was the end of 300 years of colonial order. In 1821, the banners of Spain were lowered from the towers of Mexico City. Bells rang through the streets as crowds gathered to celebrate independence. After 3 centuries of colonial rule, Mexico was finally free. But beneath the cheers and flags, the city trembled with uncertainty. Freedom had come, but no one knew what it meant. Mexico City, once the polished jewel of New Spain, was now the capital of a fragile new republic. The Spanish officials were gone, but the systems they built remained. Power shifted among generals, priests, and politicians, each claiming to represent the people, yet each struggling to hold the city together. It was independence, yes, but independence built on chaos. The early decades of the 19th century were marked by instability. The new nation cycled through emperors, dictators, and presidents with dizzying speed. The first emperor, Agustín de Iturbide, was crowned in 1822 with grand ceremonies in Mexico City's cathedral, only to be overthrown a year later and executed. The republic that followed was weak, constantly threatened by rival factions and foreign powers. The streets of the capital echoed with marches, gunfire, and political unrest. Behind the colonial facades, a city of intrigue was forming. Newspapers spreading revolutionary ideas, salons discussing politics, and secret societies plotting coups. Mexico City was both the brain and the battleground of the new nation.
But the struggle for stability wasn't just political, it was physical. The grand city Spain had left behind was crumbling. Floods continued to devastate neighborhoods. The drainage system, built on the remnants of Lake Texcoco, barely functioned. Poverty spread through the barrios, and the once mighty palaces began to decay. And then came a blow that shook the entire country. In 1846, war broke out between Mexico and the United States. By 1847, American troops were marching toward Mexico City. The defense of the capital became a desperate stand. At Chapultepec Castle, a group of young cadets, some barely in their teens, fought to the death rather than surrender. They became known as Los Niños Héroes, the boy heroes, symbols of sacrifice and patriotism. But heroism couldn't stop defeat. The U.S. Army entered Mexico City that September. For the first time since the conquest of Cortés, the city had fallen to a foreign army. The American flag flew over the National Palace. When the war ended in 1848, Mexico had lost half its territory, lands that would become California, Texas, and much of the American Southwest. The people of Mexico City were left with humiliation and despair. Yet, true to its history, the city endured. In the years that followed, a new era of reform began. Benito Juárez rose to challenge the old hierarchies of church and army. The Leyes de Reforma, reform laws, aimed to create a modern, secular Mexico. Mexico City became the center of these sweeping changes. Monasteries were closed, church lands were confiscated, streets were renamed, statues erected, and schools opened. The old colonial order was fading, and a new vision of a republican city was emerging. But progress came with conflict. The conservatives, backed by the church and old elites, refused to yield. Civil war broke out, and once again the streets of Mexico City became a battlefield. And when that war ended, another threat appeared, this time from across the Atlantic. In 1862, France, under Emperor Napoleon III, invaded Mexico. The goal was to establish a new empire in the Americas, led by an Austrian archduke named Maximilian of Habsburg. For a time, Mexico City became a European court in the New World. The French army occupied the city, and Maximilian ruled from Chapultepec Castle, transforming it into a palace of European elegance. Gardens, boulevards, and opera houses were built. The Paseo de la Emperatriz, today's Paseo de la Reforma, was created to mimic the grand avenues of Paris. But behind the grandeur was fragility. Most Mexicans rejected the foreign emperor. The liberal forces, led by Juárez, fought tirelessly from the north. The empire was built on illusion. supported by French bayonets, not Mexican loyalty. By 1867, the empire collapsed. Maximilian was captured and executed in Querétaro. The French withdrew, and Juárez returned to Mexico City in triumph. Once again, the city changed hands, and once again, it survived. Juárez's victory restored the republic, but the wounds of war ran deep. The economy was shattered, the population impoverished, and the divisions between rich and poor wider than ever. The following decades would be dominated by one man who promised order and progress: Porfirio Díaz. Díaz took power in 1876 and ruled for more than 30 years, a period known as the Porfiriato. Under his rule, Mexico City was transformed. Railways linked it to every corner of the country, electric trams replaced horse-drawn carriages, European architecture reshaped its skyline, French facades, ironwork balconies, and grand public buildings gave the city a new identity. The Palacio de Bellas Artes, the Post Office Palace, and the wide Avenida de la Reforma reflected Díaz's vision of a modern European Mexico. The elite dined in Parisian-style cafes, attended the opera, and built mansions in the new neighborhoods of Roma and Juárez.
But not everyone shared in this prosperity. Behind the shining facade, inequality deepened. The working class lived in overcrowded tenements, and the rural poor were pushed off their lands. While Mexico City gleamed with electric lights and imported marble, discontent simmered beneath the surface. The newspapers praised progress, but whispers of rebellion grew. And in 1910, the storm finally broke. The Mexican Revolution erupted, a massive, decade-long conflict that would reshape the nation and Mexico City itself. Armies of peasants, workers, and rebels marched under leaders like Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa. They fought not just for power, but for justice, land, and dignity. As the fighting spread, Mexico City became the ultimate prize once again. The capital changed hands multiple times between rival factions. Streets filled with soldiers and refugees. Food shortages gripped the city, and disease spread through its overcrowded districts. But amid the chaos, something extraordinary happened. The revolution awakened a new national identity. By 1920, when the fighting finally ended, Mexico City was battered, but alive. A new generation of artists, thinkers, and builders began to reimagine what Mexico could be. The city became a canvas for revolutionary ideals, murals, schools, and public projects celebrating the people rather than the elites. And from that rebirth came a cultural explosion. Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros turned the city into an open-air gallery of political art. The walls of government buildings told the stories of peasants, workers, and revolutionaries. The murals transformed history into a living memory. The revolution had torn Mexico apart, but in Mexico City, it gave birth to a new spirit.